wind does not howl in the Kiwitin Barrens. It screams. It is a constant physical pressure, a wall of sub-zero air that strips heat from the body in minutes. To survive here is an act of defiance. To thrive here, as the Inuit had for generations, requires an intimate, almost symbiotic relationship with the land. It requires a respect for the boundaries between the living and the dead. But in mid-November of 1930, those boundaries were violated. Welcome to the file. This is an examination of the Angikuni Lake incident. Before we dissect the theories or analyze the skepticism that has accumulated over nearly a century, we must first walk the ground. We must reconstruct the timeline of the anomaly itself. We must stand in the snow alongside Joe Labelle and look upon a stillness that should not exist. The coordinates place us in what is now the Kivalliq region of Nunavut, Canada. It is a landscape of stark, monochromatic beauty. In summer, it is a maze of waterways and rocky outcrops. In winter, it is a white void. Joe Labelle was not a tourist. He was a trapper, a man hardened by the North, familiar with the brutal calculus of survival. He knew the territory. More importantly, he knew the people. The village at the edge of Lake Angikuni was a known way station. It was a place of warmth, trade, and life in a region that offered little of any. This was a community of roughly 30 men, women, and children. They were not nomads in the transient sense. They were established. They had structures. They had routines. On a biting afternoon, with the sun already dipping low toward the horizon, Labelle guided his snowshoes toward the settlement. He was tired. The cold was a heavy weight on his shoulders. He anticipated the sensory markers of human habitation. He expected the smell of wood smoke, the acrid tang of currying leather, the chaotic barking of sled dogs, and the welcoming shouts of children. Instead, the wind carried nothing. The silence of the tundra is usually absolute, but the silence of a village is different. It is heavy. It is wrong. As Labelle crested the ridge overlooking the lake, the visual data did not match the expected pattern. The shacks and tents were there, silhouetted against the graying sky. But there was no movement. No chimneys exhaled smoke into the freezing air. The stillness was total. Labelle felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. In the wilderness, silence is often a precursor to danger. It usually means a predator is near. But this was a silence of absence. He descended the slope, calling out greetings in several dialects. His voice would have been swallowed instantly by the vastness, deadened by the snow. There was no reply. He reached the perimeter of the village. The snow between the structures was drifted and undisturbed by recent footprints. This was the first anomaly. If the villagers had left, there should have been a track. A migration of 30 people leaves a scar on the landscape. A trampled path of sled runners and boot prints heading toward the horizon. There was nothing. The snow was a smooth, white sheet, broken only by the wind-sculpted drifts. Labelle moved to the nearest shelter. It was a structure of skin and wood, battered by the elements, but intact. He pushed aside the flap and stepped out of the wind. The interior was dark, but his eyes adjusted. What he found inside was not a crime scene, but a frozen tableau. It was a still life of interruption. A pot hung over the fire pit. Inside, a stew of caribou and fish had long since frozen solid. It was blackened with mold, indicating it had been sitting for days, perhaps weeks. But the preparations suggested it had been abandoned in the middle of cooking. A meal does not cook itself. Someone had been tending this fire. Someone had been stirring this pot. And then, in an instant, they were gone. Labelle moved deeper into the village, his anxiety mounting. He checked structure after structure. The narrative remained consistent and consistently disturbing. In one tent, he found a partially mended sealskin coat. The bone needle was still stuck in the hide, the thread trailing off. It was a task paused, not finished. In another, he found a child's toy carved from wood, lying on the sleeping furs, as if just dropped. These details are crucial. They eliminate the theory of a planned migration. When a community moves in the Arctic, it is a massive, logistical undertaking. Everything is packed. Every scrap of food, every weapon, every tool is essential. To leave behind a sewing needle is careless. To leave behind a coat is dangerous. But what Labelle found next shifted the situation from puzzling to impossible. Leaning against the wall of a shack and tucked into the corners of the tents were rifles. To the uninitiated, this might seem like a minor detail. To a man like Labelle, and to anyone familiar with the laws of the North, this was terrifying. A rifle is life. It is the primary means of acquiring food, and the only defense against polar bears and wolves. An Inuit hunter would sooner walk out into the snow naked than without his rifle. Yet here they were, rusted by the ambient moisture, cold to the touch, but present. The villagers had left behind their technology. They had left behind their survival. Labelle exited the shack, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The sun was gone now. The twilight was shifting into the deep indigo of an Arctic night. He needed to leave. The psychological weight of the empty village was becoming unbearable. But before he fled, he found 2 more pieces of evidence that cemented the high strangeness of the event. Near the edge of the tree line, away from the main cluster of tents, he found the dogs. There were 7 of them. They were Canadian Eskimo dogs, powerful animals bred for endurance and loyalty. They were tied to stumps and rocks, the standard practice to keep them from fighting or wandering. They were dead. Labelle knelt beside them, inspecting the carcasses. There were no wounds, no signs of struggle, no bear tracks. Their ribs protruded sharply against their matted fur. They had not been killed, they had starved. This is perhaps the most disturbing element of the physical evidence. These dogs were valuable assets. They were the engines of transportation. If the village had migrated, the dogs would have been pulling the sleds. If the village had been attacked, the dogs would have fought. Instead, they had been left tied up to die slowly. And why had they died? They were surrounded by food. The caches in the village were full of dried fish and caribou. The pots in the tents held frozen stew. The dogs had starved to death mere yards from sustenance, waiting for masters who never returned to feed them. The horror of the scene was compounded by the timeline. Labelle estimated the dogs had been dead for weeks. Whatever had removed the people had happened long enough ago for the animals to succumb to hunger. Yet the village itself looked as if the people had vanished moments ago. Labelle turned his back on the grim discovery and made for the ice of the lake, intending to put miles between himself and this graveyard of silence. But the landscape had one final violation to reveal. On the outskirts of the settlement, where the ground rose slightly, lay the ancestral burial ground. The Inuit heap stones over their dead to protect them from scavengers and the permafrost. These cairns are sacred. They are permanent. Labelle saw that the earth here was churned and broken. He approached cautiously. One grave had been opened, then another. In total, he found that several graves had been disturbed. The stones had been unpiled and cast aside. The ground, frozen as hard as iron, had been dug out. The bodies were gone. This was not the work of animals. Wolves and bears do not unstack heavy stones with precision. They do not dig perfectly rectangular voids in the permafrost. And they certainly do not remove bodies without leaving a gruesome mess of bone and fabric. The graves were simply empty. The level of strangeness here reaches a critical peak. We have a village where the living vanished without taking their means of survival, and the dead vanished from their final resting places. The temporal anchoring of the site had been severed. The past, the ancestors, and the present, the villagers, had been erased simultaneously. Labelle did not stay to investigate further. The creeping dread that had begun as a whisper was now a scream in his mind, matching the rising wind. He was a brave man, but this was outside the realm of courage. This was a confrontation with the irrational. He trekked for miles through the dark, pushing his body to the limit, until he reached a telegraph office at a nearby outpost. His report to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police was frantic, disjointed, but clear on the core facts. He told them of the fire that should have been hot. He told them of the rifles that should have been shouldered. He told them of the dogs that should have been barking. When the RCMP eventually arrived at the site, they confirmed Labelle's description, but they also added a detail to the official file that pushes this narrative from a mystery into the realm of the unexplained. The officers spoke with other trappers in the area. These men had not been near the village, but they had been watching the sky. They reported seeing a strange light on the horizon several nights prior. It was not the aurora borealis. The northern lights are a curtain of green and violet that undulates. This light was different. They described a large, cylindrical object that transformed into a bullet shape. It moved silently across the sky, glowing with a blue, unnatural luminescence, before descending toward the area of Angikuni Lake. We must pause here. We must detach ourselves from the sensationalism that often follows such reports and look at the data points. We have a timeline discontinuity. Food cooking versus dogs starved. We have a psychological impossibility. Hunters leaving rifles. We have a physical anomaly. Frozen earth excavated and bodies removed. We have a witness, Joe Labelle, a credible, experienced woodsman. The village was not destroyed. It was not raided. It was simply switched off. The continuity of human existence in that specific coordinate was severed. As the wind buried the village in snow, concealing the starved dogs and the empty graves, the question was not just where they went. The question was what kind of force can select a specific group of people, extract them from their environment, strip the dead from the earth, and leave the surrounding world completely untouched. This is the incident at Angikuni Lake. The evidence is a collection of negatives: what was not there, what was not taken, what was not heard. And as we delve deeper into the investigation in the next segment, we will find that the silence Labelle encountered was only the first layer of a much deeper, much colder mystery. Part 2. The context. To understand the anomaly of Angikuni Lake, we must first dismantle the image of the isolated, frozen wasteland as a place of static silence. The barren lands, or the Kivalliq region of what is now Nunavut, are not empty. They are a complex, shifting topography of migration routes, wind patterns, and geological indifference. When Joe Labelle stepped onto the shore in November of 1930, he was not walking into a vacuum, but into a highly specific intersection of geography, failing economics, and a media ecosystem hungry for the bizarre. Let us begin with the geography. Angikuni is not a small pond. It is a significant expansion of the Kazan River, a waterway that acts acts as a central artery for the region. In 1930, this was not recreational territory. It was a workspace. The Kazan River was the lifeblood of the Caribou Inuit, specifically the Ahermiut, or the people of the out-of-the-way place. Their entire existence relied on the seasonal interception of caribou herds crossing the river. This context is vital because it dictates the architecture of the settlement Labelle claimed to find. The word village invokes images of permanent structures, town squares, and rooted foundations. However, the architecture of the barren lands in this era was transient. Skin tents, snow houses, and semi-permanent sod structures were the norm. A settlement here was a living organism that moved with the biology of the herd. If the caribou shifted their migration path by 20 miles, the human population had to shift with them or face starvation. Therefore, the premise of a permanent village of 2,000 people, as some exaggerated retellings later claimed, is logistically impossible for that specific latitude and era. The land could not support that density of static population. Labelle's original report, before it was inflated by decades of telephone games, referred to a camp of perhaps 30 to 25 people. This number is manageable. This number is realistic. And that realism makes the subsequent disappearance far more unsettling than a fantastical city vanishing into thin air. We must also look at the observer. Who was Joe Labelle? In the lore, he is cast as the rugged, unimpeachable witness, a man of the bush who could read the snow like a newspaper. Archival records confirm that Labelle was indeed a licensed trapper operating in the Northwest Territories. He was not a tourist. He possessed the technical literacy of the wilderness. He knew the difference between a camp that had been packed up and moved and a camp that had been interrupted. Labelle would have known the signs of a methodical departure. In a standard migration, valuable items are packed. Sleds are loaded. Weapons, the primary tool for survival, are never left behind. The central anomaly in Labelle's account is not that the people were gone, but that their technology remained. To a trapper in 1930, a rifle was not just an object, it was a lifeline. It represented a significant financial investment and the only means of procuring food. Finding a cache of rifles leaning against a wall in an abandoned camp is the psychological equivalent of finding a wallet full of cash and a set of car keys on the sidewalk today. It implies a panic so sudden that the basic instinct for self-preservation was overridden. But we must contextualize Labelle himself within the year 1930. The world was 1 year into the Great Depression. The price of furs had collapsed. The economic machinery that drove men like Labelle into these hostile environments was grinding to a halt. trappers were desperate. They were isolated, malnourished, and under immense psychological strain. This is the era of cabin fever, a very real psychological condition documented in the North, where the mind, starved of stimuli and human contact, begins to manufacture its own reality. Did Labelle hallucinate? It is a convenient theory, but it fails to address the physical evidence he claimed to find, specifically the dogs. The detail of the sled dogs starved to death, while tethered, is the most clinical and gruesome aspect of the narrative. In the economy of the North, dogs were the engine. They were transportation. To leave them tied up to die is an act of madness or an act of extreme haste. If Labelle invented the story, this detail is a stroke of dark genius. It violates the fundamental code of the bush. It is a detail designed to repulse and terrify. Now we must pivot to the mechanism of the story's transmission. How did a rumor from the edge of the Arctic Circle reach the breakfast tables of New York and London? The vector was a journalist named Emmett E. Kelleher. The story first appeared in the Danville Bee and was quickly picked up by wire services. We have to understand the media landscape of the early 20th century. This was the golden age of the newspaper, but also an era of high competition and sensationalism. Editors needed copy that grabbed the reader. The mysterious North was a popular trope. Stories of lost patrols, mad trappers, and ancient curses sold papers. Kelleher's article is the patient zero of this infection. When we analyze the text of the original reports, we see the embellishments beginning to take root. The size of the village fluctuates. The atmospheric details become more gothic. The narrative shifts from a police report to a ghost story. This brings us to the counter-narrative, the official stance of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. The RCMP is a paramilitary force. Their records are bureaucratic, dry, and obsessed with logistics. In 1931, after the story gained traction, the RCMP launched an inquiry. Sergeant J. Nelson filed a report that is the antithesis of Labelle's account. Nelson stated clearly that he could find no evidence of a village at that location. He interviewed local Inuit, who denied that a settlement of that size existed on Angikuni Lake. The police report suggests that the entire event was a fabrication. A tall tale spun by a trapper perhaps, looking for a meal, a warm bed, or 5 minutes of fame, which was then amplified by a journalist looking for a headline. However, the dismissal by the RCMP contains its own complexities. In the 1930s, the relationship between the RCMP and the indigenous population, as well as the independent trappers, was fraught with tension. The police were the arm of the state, imposing order on a chaotic frontier. It was in their best interest to quell rumors of supernatural disappearances or mass deaths that they could not explain, admitting that a group of citizens had vanished without a trace would be an admission of a loss of control. Furthermore, the RCMP investigation took place months after the alleged discovery. In the barren lands, months might as well be centuries. Snow covers tracks. Scavengers scatter remains. The topography changes. If a small camp had been decimated by disease, starvation, or violence, and the bodies covered by snowfall, a patrol arriving in the spring might find nothing but scrub brush and rock. There is also the cultural mistranslation to consider. The Caribou Inuit have a spiritual landscape that is invisible to the European eye. There are places that are considered taboo, areas where the veil between the living and the dead is thin. Labelle claimed that a grave had been emptied. The earth was dug up, the stones stacked alongside, and the body removed. In Western Gothic tradition, this screams of resurrection or grave robbing. But we must look at this through the lens of anthropology. The Inuit of this region typically practiced surface burial or cairn burial, covering the deceased with stones because the permafrost made digging deep graves impossible. If Labelle saw an open cairn, it might not have been a supernatural event. Bears are known to dismantle cairns to get to the remains. A disturbed grave is a biological reality of the tundra, not necessarily a spiritual one. Yet Labelle interpreted it as a violation. He projected his own cultural fears onto the scene. We also cannot ignore the high strangeness that permeates the region. The Angikuni mystery does not exist in a vacuum. The Northwest Territories have a long history of anomalous lights and aerial phenomena. In the 1930s, before the term UFO was coined, people reported phantom airships and strange, cylindrical lights in the sky. Labelle himself and subsequent retellings mention pulses of light on the horizon. At the time, this was often dismissed as the aurora borealis, but the description artificial, rhythmic, bluish hues near the ground does not always align with the behavior of the northern lights. So we have a triangulation of data. First, the geography. A harsh, unforgiving landscape where survival hangs by a thread and migration is mandatory. Second, the witness. Joe Labelle, a man possibly suffering from the isolation of the Depression-era fur trade, encountering a scene he could not process. Third, the amplifier. The sensationalist press of the 1930s, turning a localized oddity into a global legend. And fourth, the official denial. The RCMP, an organization dedicated to order, erasing the disorder from the record. What makes the Angikuni Lake mystery so enduring is not the presence of evidence, but the specific quality of the absence. It is a locked room mystery where the room is the size of a country. If the village simply moved, where did they go? The RCMP could not locate them in nearby settlements. If they died, where were the bodies? The barren lands preserve organic matter. They do not erase it quickly. And if it was all a lie, why has the story persisted in the oral traditions of the North, whispered not just by white trappers, but acknowledged as a dark curiosity by the locals? We are left with a picture of a specific cultural moment. The 1930s were a time when the map was still being filled in, when radio waves were just beginning to shrink the world, but the dark corners were still pitch black. The technology of communication was faster than the technology of travel. A story could travel around the world in a day, but a policeman took weeks to reach the crime scene. In that lag time, that temporal gap between the claim and the investigation, the legend of Angikuni Lake calcified. It became a modern myth, not because of what was found, but because of what was lost. It tapped into a primal fear that civilization is fragile, that our tools and our weapons can be rendered useless in an instant, and that we can be plucked from the face of the earth, leaving nothing behind but a pot of stew hanging over a cold fire. As we move into the final analysis, we must sift through these layers. We must separate the tabloid fiction from the anthropological fact. We must ask if there is a core of truth buried under the snow, or if the village of the dead is simply a reflection of the emptiness that surrounds it. Part 3. The investigation. The snow covers everything eventually, but before the physical evidence was buried under the drifts of the Kivalliq region, the paper trail began. When we approach the Angikuni Lake incident from the perspective of an investigator, we are immediately confronted with a problem that plagues many historical anomalies. We are not looking at a crime scene. We are looking at the absence of one. To understand why this mystery remains a cornerstone of high strangeness, we must first examine the official response. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the RCMP, occupy a central role in this narrative, acting as the anchor of rationality in a sea of speculation. The first official ripples of the Angikuni event reached the public not through a police blotter, but through the press. On November 27th, 1930, a headline appeared in the Danville Bee and was subsequently syndicated across North America. It read, "Village of Dead is found by Wanderer." The article, written by journalist Emmett E. Kelleher, detailed Joe Labelle's harrowing discovery. This media explosion forced the hand of the authorities. The narrative suggests that the RCMP launched an inquiry shortly after the story broke. However, this is where the historical record begins to fracture. According to the lore, the officers who arrived at the site confirmed Labelle's testimony. They allegedly found the hut standing, the food stores frozen, and the needle still stuck in the unfinished seal skin garb. They found the dogs, starved to death despite the proximity to food. Most disturbingly, they confirmed the desecration of the ancestral graves. The earth had been turned and the cairns toppled. Yet, if we dig into the archives of the RCMP, we find a very different story. In January of 1931, Sergeant J. Nelson filed a report that attempted to dismantle the entire event. Nelson stated that he had interviewed local trappers and traders in the district. His report concluded that no such village existed at that specific location. He argued that a settlement of 2,000 people, or even 30 people, depending on which version of the legend you read, could not have existed in that remote area without the trading posts knowing about it. Nelson claimed the story was a fabrication by Kelleher, the journalist, designed to sell papers during the early, desperate years of the Great Depression. The official stance of the RCMP has remained consistent for nearly a century. They maintain that the Angikuni Lake village disappearance is a non-event, an urban legend born before the term existed. But this dismissal creates a paradox. If the village never existed, who was Joe Labelle? Labelle was a real man, a licensed trapper with a reputation for competence. Why would a seasoned woodsman invent a story that made him look terrified? In the 1930s, admitting fear of the supernatural was not a way to gain respect among the rugged communities of the North. It was a way to lose your credibility. Let us analyze the evidence, assuming for a moment that Labelle did stumble upon something. The first theory to address is mass migration. It is the most comfortable explanation for the skeptical mind. Inuit communities were semi-nomadic. They moved with the caribou herds. Perhaps the village simply packed up and left. However, the forensic evidence of the scene makes this technically impossible. A migration is a planned logistical event. It involves the packing of sleds, the gathering of weapons, and the movement of livestock. The testimony describes valuable rifles left leaning against walls. In the harsh economy of the North, a rifle was life. Leaving a weapon behind was tantamount to suicide. Furthermore, there is the matter of the clothing. Labelle described needles left in unfinished sewing. This implies an interruption of instantaneous speed. A migration takes hours, if not days, to organize. This was an evacuation that happened in seconds. Then we must address the dogs. The description of the sled dogs is the most visceral and disturbing element of the case. 7 dogs tied to trees, starved to death. A nomadic tribe relies on their dogs for transportation and hunting. They are the engine of survival. If the tribe migrated, they would have taken the dogs. If the tribe fled in a panic, they might have left the dogs. But why did the dogs die of starvation? pathology of the scene suggests time is distorted here. If the food in the pots was still fresh enough to be identified, but the dogs had died of starvation, there is a temporal disconnect. It takes weeks for a dog to starve. It takes hours for a pot of stew to freeze. These two timelines do not match, unless the village was abandoned weeks prior, and the environmental conditions preserved the interior of the huts in a way that defies thermodynamics. We must also consider the desecrated graves. This detail is often overlooked in favor of the vanishing people, but it is perhaps the most critical piece of behavioral evidence. In Inuit culture, the respect for the dead is paramount. To disturb a cairn is to invite spiritual retribution. If the villagers left voluntarily, they would not have dug up their ancestors. If a hostile third-party raiders or another tribe had attacked, they might have looted the living. But there is little strategic value in unearthing the frozen dead. The emptying of the graves suggests a motivation that is neither survival nor warfare. It suggests a ritualistic or incomprehensible directive. This leads us into the territory of high strangeness. In the years following the disappearance, witnesses from the area, separate from Labelle, reported seeing strange lights in the sky above the lake. Blue, pulsating orbs that hovered silently. In modern ufology, we would label these as unidentified aerial phenomena. In 1930, they were simply monsters or spirits. The Torngarsuk, a powerful sky deity in Inuit mythology, is often associated with weather and the firmament. Some folklorists have attempted to draw a line between the blue lights and the anger of the sky spirits. But the intersection of indigenous folklore and modern alien abduction theory is a murky water to tread. It is easy to project our current cultural obsession with extraterrestrials onto the past. However, the silence is what speaks loudest. There were no bodies, no signs of struggle, no blood in the snow, just a void where community used to be. Now, let us shift our focus to the digital archaeology of this case. How does a story from 1930 survive to haunt the forums of the 21st century? The Angikuni mystery has become a piece of digital folklore, a ghost in the machine. If you search the archives of the early internet, the Usenet groups of the 1990s, and the paranormal forums of the early 2000s, you see the story evolving. In the digital strata, the facts mutate. The population of the village fluctuates. In Kelleher's original report, the number was roughly 25 to 30. By the time the story reached the paperback era of the 1950s, popularized by Frank Edwards in his book Stranger Than Science, the number had ballooned to 2,000. The internet took the larger number and ran with it. We see a phenomenon here known as information entropy. As the data is copied and pasted from one thread to another, the nuance degrades and the sensationalism sharpens. The story becomes a creepypasta, stripped of its historical context and presented as pure horror fodder. But trace the digital footprints back, and you find that the core anomaly remains resistant to debunking. The scan of the original Danville B article exists. It is a verified artifact. The existence of Joe Labelle is verified. The RCMP denial is verified. We are left with two conflicting realities. In one reality, a sensationalist journalist and a lonely trapper concocted a lie that got out of hand. In the other reality, a small community was removed from the face of the earth by a force that left no physical tracks, only a lingering static in the air. Why has this remained unsolved? It remains unsolved because it exists in a liminal space between history and mythology. It is unsolved because the physical site, the location of the huts, has been reclaimed by the tundra. Wood rots, bones scatter. The landscape of the Canadian Shield is vast and indifferent to human preservation. There is no crime scene to revisit with modern forensics. There is no DNA to sequence. There are only the yellowed pages of old newspapers and the digital echoes of those who want to believe. The police reports from Sergeant Nelson define the event by its impossibility. He solved the case by declaring there was no case. But for those who study the strange, a denial is often just a lid placed on a boiling pot. The investigation of Angikuni Lake is not a search for a perpetrator. It is a confrontation with the unknown. It challenges our understanding of permanence. We build our homes, we cook our food, we bury our dead, and we assume that these acts anchor us to reality. Angikuni suggests that the anchor can be cut. In the final analysis, the evidence is not what was found, but what was taken. The people were taken. The ancestors were taken. And eventually, the truth was taken, leaving us with nothing but a cold wind blowing across a frozen lake and a story that refuses to die. The village is gone. The investigation is closed. But on the digital networks, in the late hours of the night, the discussion continues. We keep the vigil. We keep retelling the story of the day the world blinked, and 30 people vanished into the whiteout. Perhaps the answer lies not in the snow, but in the sky. Or perhaps the most terrifying answer is the simplest one, that we are all just temporary residents, waiting for the wind to change. This concludes our file on the Angikuni Lake incident. Part 4. The aftermath. The snow does not keep secrets, but it does bury them. When the wind sweeps across the Kiiwetin Barrens, it acts as an eraser, smoothing over the indentations of boot prints, sled runners, and the final resting places of the dead. We have examined the discovery of the empty village, the impossible details of the abandoned rifles and the starved huskies, and the terrifying implication of the desecrated graves. Now we must examine what remained after Joe Labelle fled into the white static of the storm. We must look at the scar tissue this event left on the collective consciousness of the 20th century. When a stone is thrown into a dark lake, the splash is violent and immediate, but the ripples last far longer, distorting the reflection of the sky for minutes, or in this case, decades. The Angikuni Lake incident ceased to be a mere missing persons case the moment the story hit the telegraph lines. It transmuted into something else entirely. It became modern folklore. It became a data point in the catalog of human fears. In the immediate wake of the report published in the Danville Bee in late November of 1930, the reaction was a mixture of morbid fascination and administrative denial. We must look at the official response with a critical, almost forensic eye. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the custodians of order in the chaotic North, attempted to cauterize the wound in the narrative. Sergeant J. Nelson was dispatched to investigate the claims. His report, filed in January of 1931, is a document of cold, bureaucratic dismissal. Nelson stated clearly that he could find no evidence of a village of such size existing at that specific location. He noted that trappers in the area, men who knew the rhythm of the land better than their own heartbeats, had not reported an established settlement of thousands, or even hundreds, at Angikuni. To the skeptic, this is the end of the line. The case is closed. A fabrication by a journalist named Emmett E. Kelleher, designed to sell papers during the lean, desperate years of the Great Depression. A tall tale spun to entertain a populace hungry for distractions. But as digital archaeologists, we know that the official denial is rarely the end of the story. It is merely a layer of sediment. The denial by the RCMP did not kill the legend. It unwittingly preserved it by declaring the village non-existent. They moved the Angikuni incident from the realm of criminal investigation into the realm of the paranormal. If the village was not there, then where did the story come from? If Joe Labelle lied, why was the detail of the starving dogs so visceral, so specific, and so cruel? The legacy of Angikuni is not found in police files, but in the mutation of the story itself. It is a study in mimetic evolution. In 1930, the number of missing villagers was reported as roughly 30 men, women, and children. By the time Frank Edwards included the account in his seminal 1959 book, Stranger Than Science, the number had ballooned. In later retellings, during the UFO craze of the 1970s, the population of the vanishing village was often cited as 1,200, or even 2,000 people. This inflation is significant. It suggests that the public subconscious was not satisfied with a small tragedy. We needed a cataclysm. We needed a mass abduction. The story grew to match the scale of our existential dread during the Cold War. The emptiness of the tundra became a canvas upon which we projected our fear of nuclear annihilation, of being wiped off the map without a trace. Let us turn our gaze to the site as it exists today. If you were to open a satellite view of Nunavut right now, typing the coordinates of Angikuni Lake into the search bar, you would be greeted by a mosaic of greens, browns, and the deep ink black of the water. The resolution in these remote areas is often lower than that of urban centers. The landscape renders as a blur of pixels, a digital impressionism of rock and lichen. There are no pins dropped for a ghost town. There are no user reviews for the empty village. The location is aggressively silent. It is a liminal space in the truest sense. It is a threshold between the known world of data and mapping and the unknown world of the deep wilderness. Travelers who go there today, mostly sport fishermen and seasoned adventurers, report a profound sense of isolation. The wind at Angikuni has a particular timbre. It does not howl so much as it drones, a low-frequency vibration that settles in the chest. It is a place where the horizon line seems to curve more sharply, reminding you that you are standing on the top of the world, precarious and exposed. The physical site has reclaimed whatever structures might have stood there. Wood rots quickly in the damp cycles of thaw and freeze, or it is repurposed by passing Inuit hunters and trappers. The earth swallows evidence. If there were cairns of stones used to mark the desecrated graves, they have long since toppled, scattering back into the chaos of the glacial till. However, the site exists in another form. It exists in the architecture of the internet. Search for Angikuni Lake online, and you enter a rabbit hole of archived corruption. You will find scanned PDFs of old newspapers, the ink faded and the text barely legible. You will find forums on cryptozoology websites where users debate the timeline of Joe Labelle's arrival. You will find grainy YouTube videos with synthesized voiceovers retelling the narrative, adding layers of distortion with every upload. The story has become a digital ghost. It haunts the servers. It is a piece of code that refuses to be deleted. This is the true aftermath of the event. The physical village may or may not have existed, but the digital village of Angikuni is real, and it is populated by the obsessed, the curious, and the frightened. What questions remain unanswered? The most haunting ambiguity is not about the people, but about the dogs. In almost every version of the legend, from the 1930 newsprint to the modern creepypasta, the detail of the sled dogs remains constant. 7 dogs tied to trees, starved to death. Why this detail? If this was a hoax, why invent something so gruesome? A hoaxer usually wants to elicit wonder, not revulsion. The death of the dogs suggests a breakdown of the natural order. In the Arctic, the dog is life. The dog is the engine. To leave them behind is suicide. To leave them to suffer is madness. This detail anchors the story in a reality that feels too gritty to be pure fiction. It suggests that whatever happened, whether it was a migration, a mistake, or a fabrication, was surrounded by an aura of panic. It implies a disruption so severe that the most basic tenets of survival were abandoned. We are also left with the question of the lights in the sky. Labelle and the mounting police purportedly saw flashes of blue light on the horizon. In the modern era, we immediately categorize this as unidentified aerial phenomena. But in 1930, the vocabulary of flying saucers did not exist in the public zeitgeist. They were described simply as unnatural illuminations. Were they the aurora borealis, misidentified by men on the edge of exhaustion? Or were they the signature of the force that scrubbed the village from the earth? We will likely never know the empirical truth of what stood on the rocky shores of Angikuni Lake. The witnesses are dead. The paper trail is circular. The land is indifferent. But perhaps the truth is less important than the feeling the story evokes. We live in an era of hypersurveillance. We carry tracking devices in our pockets. Our movements are logged, our purchases recorded, our faces recognized by algorithms. We are constantly perceived. In such a world, the idea of vanishing, of truly, completely disappearing, is both a fantasy and a terror. The Angikuni Lake Village represents the ultimate glitch in the system. It is a reminder that the world is not fully mapped. It suggests that there are holes in the fabric of reality, drainage points where people, history, and sound can slip away. As we conclude this excavation of the Angikuni mystery, consider the nature of the unknown. We try to fill the void with theories. We blame aliens, spirits, government conspiracies, or dimensional rifts. We do this because the alternative is intolerable. The alternative is that the universe is vast, cold, and random. The alternative is that a community of people can simply cease to be, and the wind will continue to blow, and the snow will continue to fall, and the sun will rise on an empty tundra, utterly unconcerned with our absence. The village is gone. The dogs are silent. The graves are open to the sky. And somewhere in the high north, the wind is still erasing the evidence, waiting for the next traveler to stumble upon a silence that is too loud to bear. This concludes our analysis of the Angikuni Lake incident. The file remains open, but the pages are blank.